Many of you, if not all of you, have already heard that Bob Costas made what I consider to be a monumental decision to hang up his play-by-play microphone recently. And I wanted to have an opportunity to sit down so you all could hear from Bob directly about his career, about his decision, because he is a friend of not just Nothing Personal, but also the Dan Le Batard Show. And he's made multiple appearances on both. And anytime we can get Bob Costas, we're going to do it. But you have a bonus today. It's not just Bob. It's also Dan himself. He wanted to join because he and Bob go way back. We all go way back. So first, I want to welcome Bob Costas to Nothing Personal, and also Dan Le Batard.
Hi, David.
Hello,
hi, Dan.
Gentlemen.
Thank you for welcoming us. And I just want to say, as we get started, the reason I'm here is because if this is to be punctuation on a splendiferous career, I believe Bob Costas to have had one of the most majestic broadcast careers in the history of broadcasting, not sports broadcasting. You could put him at the top of any sports broadcasting list, but just journalism and broadcasting. So I am here and eager to find out where it is we end up.
Well, where we're going to end up is with starting with Bob, because what you just said is how I feel, and it's how millions of people feel. But there was something that at the end of Bob's play-by-play career, when he was calling the Royals-Yankees series, that there was this noise about when he announced his retirement, that it was somehow correlated to that series. Yeah. And it's, in my opinion, not the truth, but I wanted you to hear it directly from Bob.
Well, it's not a matter of opinion. It's an objective truth. I told the people at TBS and at the Major League Baseball Network, where I still was doing a handful of regular season games on their showcase package, I told them more than a year ago that this would be my last year. And in fact, at the MLB Network, I've been hinting at it for a while, telling them, you know, you're going to have to hire somebody to work in addition to Matt Vasgersian, because Matt can't do all the games. So that was always my intention. Also, since I have the platform here, I had not intended to make any big look at me announcement, but Andrew Marchand, who used to be at the New York Post and now is at The Athletic, he's a very good sports media reporter, and it's his job to break stories. And he inferred something correctly from what I said right at the end of the last Yankee Royal game to Ron Darling, thanking him and all the other people I'd worked with, going back to Tony Kubek, calling games on television for the last 40 or so years. And so he snooped around, and someone at TBS or someplace must have confirmed. He called me a couple of weeks ago, whenever it was, and I said, oh, I can't tell you anything on the record, but yes, I'm not going to mislead you. I'd never do that. Yes, you've got it right. And then when he broke the story the next day, the Major League Baseball Network, and this was so kind of them, immediately sprung into action. And they showed a bunch of games that I had done over the years in the ensuing weekend. And then a week ago, Monday, they replayed The Sounds of Baseball, which is a series that I normally host with Tom Verducci, but I didn't host this one because it was about me. They had first aired that about a year ago, and they replayed it. It's a compilation of calls over the years. And then as a tack on to that, Tom Verducci interviewed me, and I spoke about the reasons behind my decision, which had nothing to do with any exterior factors. It was just by a fluke that I was even doing the games at TBS for the last 3 years. I had settled by my own design into an emeritus role, both in baseball and outside baseball, and we can talk about that in a moment. But it got out there, and so there was a reaction to it, and I tried to, give the most truthful version of events, which is the truthful version of events, which I've just told you.
But if you had scripted your exit, clearly what you're saying is you would not have scripted it the way it happened, but it's caused you to need to clarify the correlation. But yeah, but in fact, you would have still kept it secret if you had if Marchand didn't exist, no one would know you had retired.
No, I would have in due course, sometime during the off season, in some low key way, have acknowledged it. But even if the Yankees Royals series had gone exactly as I would have hoped, and everyone was, in my cheering section, I still was going to step aside. I don't know how you want this to proceed. There are particulars here that are kind of inside baseball, but maybe this is the one place to do it, as to how I wound up doing a few seasons on TBS and what led to that. But, take it wherever you want to take it.
The ending didn't feel good to me for you. One of the seminal broadcasting careers of my existence. And I will say this again, it's the history of television. Very few people have done it better than Bob Costas. There's a craftsmanship to baseball announcing that is very hard. And the noisiness and the criticism around your last games bothered me on your behalf.
And I'm aware that you expressed that, and I appreciate it very much. What matters is my own assessment. We can talk about some of the reaction, which I'm only aware of in a general sense. I'm not, diving deep into what everybody said on social media someplace. But what really mattered was my own assessment. And I just felt, as I said to Tom Verducci, I have too much regard for the game, for the craft, and for whatever my own standard has been for a long time, to not be able to consistently reach that standard. Could I do it on individual games? Yeah, even recently, even this season or the season before. Could I do it for long stretches of games? Yes. Could I do it in moments on games that aligned with what has generally been my level, whatever that level is, over the last many years? But could I consistently do it 99% of the time? Not anymore. I couldn't dot all the I's and cross all the T's as effectively as I once did. And I don't think that the fault was in the approach. The question is, how deftly do you execute the approach? I don't second guess my approach. Some of the things I said in the last few years during baseball games, I would have said when I was 35 or 40 years old. But perhaps my ability to weave whatever that tapestry is in the kind of baseball broadcast that I aspired to, I think I did that pretty well over a long period of time, but I couldn't do it as well in the last few years. So it was my own self-assessment that was involved here and nothing else.
I don't want to make you sound older than you are, but
I'm old enough.
I'm afraid you just did. So I need to clarify something with you. You would broadcast 30 years ago. When you started in 1980, you obviously were, 28 years old in a game where you didn't have much experience, and you ended up being one of the best, as Dan eloquently stated, as he always does, not just play-by-play broadcasters, because you did it differently than most. Are you suggesting that as you got older, it's not that your skills diminished, it's that the audience's ears had changed and that it was received differently, and that criticism is what bothered you?
My self-assessment was what mattered. If there had been no criticism at all, and I had a very nice ride for more than 40 years. In the big picture, I can't complain about what people's reactions have been and what the industry's reactions have been. But there comes a point where you can't quite deliver 100% of the time at the same level that you always did. And I'm aware of that from my own vantage point. But if someone wants to say, I don't care about the history, why are you mentioning that it's 74 years ago to the day when the then Cleveland Indians last won a world title for Cleveland in 1948? Why are you saying that in the first game of the series between the now Guardians and Yankees a couple of years ago? Because it's essential. Because history matters in all sports, but it matters more in baseball than any other sport. And there's a contrast. There's a contrast between the Guardians and the Yankees in that series. The Yankees hit exactly twice as many home runs that season as the Guardians did. But the Guardians took the extra base better, and they stole more bases, and they played a different style. And that contrast goes to the following, folks. It seems like an eternity to Yankee fans since 2009, then 13 years since they last went to the World Series and last won it. Well, Cleveland's been to the World Series since then, but they haven't won it in exactly 74 years. If somebody tells me that that's the wrong thing to do, I will tell them where to get off. The question is not whether it's the right thing to do. The question is, how deftly do you do it? And I think I still did that pretty well, but I didn't always do it quite as well as I might have in the past. There are external circumstances involved, but I'm not trying to make any excuse at all. The essential part is how well did I think I was doing my job? But there are external circumstances. Working with the people at TBS, all of whom I admired and respected, but it wasn't the same as at NBC because I had ongoing relationships with those people, with the producers and directors. We had established a rhythm, and NBC approached things differently. There was always, whether it was the NBA or MLB, there was always an opening narrative, which I wrote or ad-libbed and narrated, which took care of a lot of the background before the game ever began. TBS didn't do it that way. I might note that on the World Series this year, Joe Davis and Fox quite correctly traced the history between the Dodgers and the Yankees, including the Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Yankees, who met several times in the 40s and 50s in the World Series. It is part of the story. So anybody who says, don't do that, or anybody who says, why did he quote Mark Twain? Mark Twain said, lies, damn lies, and statistics, which then reminded me that the great Vin Scully once said, some people use statistics the way a drunk uses a lamppost, for support, not illumination. And when Giancarlo Stanton, we're talking about how he's a quiet figure in the clubhouse and he never complains, but in the postseason, his slugging percentage and home runs per time at bat rival the all-time greats, and there he is standing at first base. So apparently he follows Teddy Roosevelt's adage, speak softly and carry a big stick. And in his case, he does both. Now, if somebody says, whoa, that's outside my frame of reference. It was outside my frame of reference too. I was born in 1952. I knew who Teddy Roosevelt was. You were supposed to know who Teddy Roosevelt was. And if you broadcast baseball, you're supposed to know who Rogers Hornsby was. You're supposed to. You know why you're supposed to? Not just as a broadcaster, but as a functioning, sentient human being and citizen. That's what you're supposed to know. No, people who take pride in their ignorance.
Settle down, Bob. Settle down. You're unhinged. That Vin Scully quote is so good. I mean, the other quotes are good too, but the best one is from Vin Scully. That one is solid, man. That guy.
Sort of baseball related, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it was great.
What's confusing to me, though, is you're saying two different things, and I want clarification.
All right.
Either you lost a step and you can't be 100%, which I don't know. That's quite a hurdle that you've put to yourself. Or the audience's ears and tolerance has changed.
He answered your question. He said it was all self-assessment. He wasn't putting it on the audience.
Yes. The point was that if I could do it, and by the way, we're not going back to the 90s. Only a few years ago, I could do it at pretty much the same level. The audience was smaller. I was doing it in a boutique situation, which was the Major League Baseball Network. And the reason I did it was because I like baseball so much. What I was saying was, I don't think there is anything wrong with that approach. It was my approach. You know, when you make a list of the best baseball announcers, they all had, to one degree or another, differing approaches. What worked for Ernie Harwell and made him beloved was not the same thing as what worked for Jack Buck or Harry Carey in his bombastic way, or Vin Scully, or now Tom Hamilton, who's terrific on the Cleveland games, or Gary Cohen locally in New York with Ron Darling and Keith Hernandez. It's all different. To some extent, it's all what works for you, not just from a standpoint of craft, but who you are as a person. But it worked well for me. No one is universally popular. I've even seen criticism of Vin Scully, which seems insane to me. But I think that my approach and how I executed that approach was very well received for a very long time. Now, baseball wasn't the only thing I did. And I understand that younger viewers, if they weren't watching the Baseball Network, might think of me only as the Olympic guy, you know, because I hadn't done baseball on network television since 2000. That was when NBC lost baseball. So I understand if people don't associate me with the game as much as they do with other things I've done. But baseball has always been important to me. And I think it's part of my resume that I take pride in. And because I took pride in it, I didn't want to do something that I felt was beneath my own standard.
I think a lot of people know you also from your late night show, from your HBO show On the Record.
Mm-hmm.
So you were not a typical play-by-play broadcaster.
Later, one of the great interview shows there's ever been. He had any number of broadcasting opportunities that weren't sports related, that were at the very top of the journalism ladder. 60 Minutes, could have been doing Nightline, could have been doing an assortment of things. But continue, David. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. It's a show that I was lucky enough to be a guest on, Dan, and it was quite something watching Bob, who some people would view as play-by-play or a host of the Olympics or host of the NBA during my heyday with the Knicks. And here he was conducting a group of people, which included that night JJ Redick, the now coach of the Lakers. And what happened with the HBO show, other than HBO Sports imploding, was that a part of your career that you loved? Or was it way too overwhelming?
No. I loved being at HBO in the early 2000s. It was the gold standard of a certain kind of sports coverage. I was never a big boxing guy, but they did a great job with boxing, Jim Lampley and that crew. Their sports documentaries didn't just win Emmys, they won Peabody Awards under Ross Greenberg. HBO Sports was just a bastion of quality. Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel, and my show On the Record, Hard Knocks, which may not be everybody's cup of tea, but it's pretty popular. It was all done at a very, very high level. And when the Baseball Network came into existence in 2009, I was their first hire, which, again, for those who don't associate me with baseball, the people who ran that network did. And they realized that I might give them some credibility in that respect. And at HBO, they said, we want you to stay, but we have to have cable exclusivity. So they made me choose. And to show you what baseball has always meant to me, I was willing, reluctantly, but willing to leave HBO in order to go to the Baseball Network. Then the terrain changed. And a few years ago, HBO came back to me. And so we called the show Back on the Record. Didn't take much of a meeting to come to that conclusion. And I did more or less what I had done previously for the 7 or 8 years I was at HBO the first time around. And now it's interesting to me that I haven't seen much written about this, but HBO, the gold standard of a certain kind of sports coverage, journalistically, documentaries, all that sort of stuff, basically now is shuttered. Hard Knocks still exists, but there is no HBO Sports documentary unit anymore. They might occasionally do a sports-related doc, but it's folded into their larger documentary unit. It used to be 3 or 4 of these wonderful documentaries every year. Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel is gone. Bomani Jones' show is gone. My show is gone. Not because we didn't hit the quality mark. We did. All those shows did on an ongoing basis. But the media landscape has changed, and some things that don't sustain or don't meet the model anymore are gone. So I did it for 2 years, and we're very happy with the product. And when they called to tell me that they weren't going to renew it, and that everything was going, I felt bad, not so much for myself, but for the audience, for the HBO audience that had come to expect that kind of quality sports television.
What are you smirking about, David? What are you smirking about there? You're smirking about
because it's funny that feeling badly for the audience after your show gets canceled with your name on it. That is Bob Costas. And I wanted to tell him the story that I was in the room at an owners meeting when it was announced and it discussed that Bob would be joining the network. And we viewed it as an unbelievable coup.
Oh, wow.
And so, Bob, it was a full discussion. What would you be paid? How would this work? Would it be exclusive? How are we getting him? What are we going to do with him because of your gravitas in baseball and outside of baseball? And I don't know if anyone's ever told you that.
I appreciate that. You know, I was, and I aspired to this, I guess. I hope that I was a citizen of the game. Yeah, I called games, but I did documentaries and essays and retrospectives and emceed events and was called upon to do eulogies of some of the great players that I followed in my youth. I think I had a different resume, not a better, but a different resume than some other people who were broadcasters within the game. And it meant so much to me when through the years, I'd be at a batting cage or something, and a player or a coach or a manager or an executive would just come up and tell me how much they appreciated what I had meant to the game. And I don't think it's monumental, but the little niche that I had meant something to me beyond a career notch on a resume, beyond anything else people associate with it. To have been part of the game that I love above all others, and that meant the most to me from the time that I was a little kid, that has been a very important part of my professional and personal life. And I didn't want to diminish it in any way. I mentioned this to Tom Verducci a week ago. If you never saw a guy play, and the guy's in the Hall of Fame, you can go to Baseball Reference. And even if he hit 250 in his last year, that's at the bottom, but you get a sense of the whole career. Most of us don't have that benefit. The MLB Network helped me out in that respect by replaying the sounds of baseball. And, I feel fine about it. There's an old line about you won't hear all the nice things people say about you after you die. Well, the next best thing is to have some sort of milestone. And then people say, well, he's retired from that. And then the appreciations start to come in. So actually what I've heard, I don't know about some of the rabble on social media, but what I've heard from respectable sources in incredible journalism, not incredible, in 2 words, incredible journalism, and from people who I respect, people I've worked with, other broadcasters. I guess now's the time that they feel compelled to say what they didn't feel compelled to say earlier. So, I feel very good about what's happened over the last 10 days, 2 weeks.
Dan, do you know his most famous eulogy by chance?
Was it Musial?
Bob, would you even put that on your list as the top? I had a different one in mind.
I don't think you rank eulogies. They all meant.
I want to rank them.
They all meant something.
You may not rank eulogies. You don't know who you're being interviewed by, sir. We did a segment where he asked me legitimate questions about whether I would attend the funerals of the living people I still know. We did a grading system. So David Samson, this is his wheelhouse. Yes, he would like you to rank the eulogies.
Keep this in mind, as Yogi Berra once said: always attend your friends' funerals. Otherwise, they won't come to yours. So just keep that in mind. Yeah, well, I'll tell you how Musial is connected to Mantle. Mantle was the first one that I did, and Musial was there that day. And apparently Musial, as the end was approaching, told his family that he would like me to be among the eulogists for him. And so Musial kind of grew out of Mantle. Hank Aaron grew out of my personal relationship with him, as did Bob Gibson and Joe Morgan.
Who's going to do yours? That's such a huge responsibility.
I told you this is his wheelhouse. Like, he wants to explore all of this. You thought we were just talking about the end of your baseball broadcasting career. Nah, he's here to talk about the end of all of it, Bob.
You're the most famous voice.
I haven't nominated anybody.
Have you thought about it before he asked you that question? Is it
no, actually I have not.
Why would you?
I have not. I'm not young anymore, but I'm in reasonably good health. So it's not something I'm dwelling on.
It's so bad here. We're here to celebrate the life and times of Bob Costas, not end them. That's not what we're here to do. We're not here to end those times, David.
Yeah, by the way, people, and you can't blame them, people hear things in little fragments. There's so much information coming at them. And I was at a charity event night before last, and people coming out to me, what do you plan to do in retirement? Or I was so sorry to hear you retired, or congratulations upon retiring. But I'm still going to do the emeritus kind of stuff that I have been doing the last several years, just not calling games anymore. And, part of what happened coming out of this, and it's completely understandable, it's a natural thought to raise, but it's not a correct conclusion to arrive at. You can have a question, but that doesn't mean you know the answer. So some people might say, gee, I always liked Bob, but he hung on too long. Before I was 60 years old, the last contract I signed with NBC, my friend and patron Dick Ebersol left after Comcast took over in 2011. And I was of a mind to leave with him. Comcast people came in, and their exact quote was, "You are to sports what Tom Brokaw is to news. We want you around in a prominent role and then eventually in an emeritus role." And I said, okay, I will do 3 more Olympics. London was on the horizon. I'll do 3 more Olympics. I'll leave after Rio in 2016, even though I had ambivalent feelings about football. I'll do Sunday Night Football because they said it was important to them. I'll host that parallel to 2016, and I'll step aside at that point. I was a young 64 and still able to do both jobs and whatever else they asked me to do as well as I ever had. And in fact, in 2015, they said, if you want to go on a year-by-year basis, go ahead. And I said, no, 2016 is going to be it. And we didn't say a word about it during the Rio Olympics. I didn't want to even in the tiniest way be a distraction. And we didn't even mention it until we were a year out from the 2018 Olympics in South Korea. And it was at that point that we publicly passed the baton to Mike Tirico, who incidentally received the first Bob Costas scholarship at Syracuse University in 1987. So there was some symmetry in that. And I've known Mike, since then. And I think that we're all different, but he's versatile. He can host. He can do a number of sports. He can host. He can do play-by-play. So I think they made an inspired choice in turning to him. So I was completely content at 64 years old to be in an emeritus role and to continue doing the little things that I was doing at the Baseball Network. But as you know, David, those things included the Studio 42 interviews, the Greatest Games series, the Sounds of Baseball, which we began with Vin Scully and then Jack Buck, my most memorable game where we talk to people about whatever game they remember most. And during the off season, when there are no games to show and no quick pitch highlights, that's actually pretty much the staple of the network, to pull those things off the shelf and run that archival stuff. So even though the audience for that was smaller, it was an appreciative audience and is an appreciative audience. And for me, I'd been lucky enough to do a whole bunch of stuff. So I wasn't looking to, I have to stay on the air and the biggest. I left the Olympics and Sunday Night Football, the 2 most watched things in all of television, not just sports television, of my own design. I did that. I'm not the sort of person who says,
you went back though, Bob.
They're going to have to drag me out of the booth kicking and screaming. It's just a little slice, a coincidental slice of why I wound up at TBS for a short period of time, but it doesn't typify what my approach is. John Heyman and Joel Sherman, 2 of the best baseball reporters, have a podcast, and they asked me some time ago, how do you see your future? And I said, I'm an emeritus guy. That's how I see myself, and it's how I've seen myself for the better part of a decade.
You say emeritus, and that makes me think old. You were back at the Olympics in Paris this summer.
Yes.
And that was a thing for the audience to see, that sort of the connectivity. Tell me how that deal came together.
Well, I had such a good and fulfilling run at NBC of some 40 years. It was mutually beneficial across the board. And we got sideways with each other because I was inclined, I don't think I'm any one thing, but there were a number of ingredients in whatever recipe I brought to it. And I think I was more inclined toward journalism and commentary as a slice of what I did than most other network sports broadcasters, no matter how good they may be at their jobs. And I would question the IOC's affinity for authoritarian regimes. I talked about steroids in baseball when the subject was still pretty much taboo, especially on television. I talked about CTE in football on the football broadcasts and in other areas where I was asked to comment. And I think it got into a passive aggressive place that ill befit both parties. because we'd done so much that was worthwhile and fulfilling together. And there were real friendships there and professional relationships that were worthy. And so it got to a point where they threw up their hands and said, let's settle this. And I was sort of like, yeah, fine. We've had enough of this. And so we parted company, which was what led Jeff Zucker, whose first job out of Harvard was as my researcher and Brian Gumbel's researcher at the '88 Seoul Olympics. He was a wunderkind. He became the executive producer of the Today Show, like at 25, 26. And in his 30s, he's running all of NBC Universal. So eventually he's running CNN. So now I've left NBC. Jeff, my old friend, says, want to come over and be a contributor at CNN? Sure. We'll set up a real home studio.
Which they haven't done yet.
Laptop. We'll set up a whole home studio. What?
You broke up there, so I was laughing at CNN's home studio setup.
Oh, this is just my iPad at home in New York. The home studios in California. So anyway, then HBO became part of it. So I'm thinking, all right, now this is all under the banner of Time Warner. And for a short period of time, Jeff became the head of Turner Sports. And Jeff wanted to make a big splash. They had just acquired NHL rights. He hires Wayne Gretzky. He asked me if I'll come over and do some stuff with TBS's baseball coverage. And he actually wanted me to do more than I wound up doing. And I balked at that because I just didn't feel that that was appropriate for me at this time. Brian Anderson's a tremendous broadcaster, and they had other people that were in the primes of their careers, and I didn't want to get into any of that. And finally, I agreed, okay, I'll just do the division series. I think he just wanted my name on the letterhead. It made sense, and it was totally because of that personal relationship. In retrospect, I mean, he got caught up in another thing, which we won't get into. HBO, CNN, and Turner Sports were all under the same umbrella. And I thought maybe that would be, apart from the baseball network, where I would do a few years, especially because of my close personal relationship with Jeff. And then he wound up leaving, and I fulfilled the last 2 years of the deal. And that's what it was. But I was not out like looking for places to be on the air again. I was perfectly happy with the emeritus role that I had carved out years before, and I'll be happy with that role going forward. And I think I can still contribute in a very positive way, both within baseball and perhaps other sports, in that kind of role. And when you mentioned seeing me at the Olympics, it's heartening that the people at NBC reached back out to me a year or so ago and realized that, we had been very fruitful partners for a very long time, and it shouldn't have ended in quite that way. And so I think we're in the process of putting something back together, which again would be an emeritus role. I'm not going to be the primary host. I wouldn't if they asked me. I'm not going to be a play-by-play guy anymore. But people can, if they think about it, you can think of roles which would enhance their coverage without encroaching on anybody else's responsibilities or their duties.
I always admired how you bounced your journalism sensibilities and ethics against the machine. One of the times you did not mention was that you were on an NFL broadcast talking about gun control as part of an essay. Yeah. Among those fights that you were having with the corporate machine, which was the biggest of them?
CTE in football, because it was ongoing and because the NFL is not just the biggest property in all sports. It's the biggest property in a fractionalized television universe. It's the biggest property in all of entertainment. And I'm sure that some people on Park Avenue were uncomfortable with what I had said and was continuing to say. So that was probably, that was the one that was most troubling to them.
You were a bit like Cosell. You were a bit like Cosell. Cosell eventually just walked away from boxing disgusted. You never quite got to that point, but you clearly had some moral conundrums with what it is you were broadcasting for them.
Yeah, and for a long time, I have to give them credit for this. And I said this before. I certainly had more leeway than any other broadcaster did, both on NBC's airwaves and elsewhere. And when the Comcast people came in, they had done their homework. They said, we know that you had to leave HBO to go to the baseball network. We're starting the new NBC Sports Network. We'll recreate your HBO show. We'll even bring in the same staff that you had on that show to the extent that we can. And they did a show called Costas Tonight for a while. And it was a show of good quality. And it did kind of scratch some of those itches. So I give them credit for that. When you mentioned the thing at halftime, it wasn't an essay about gun control. It was about the gun culture in sports and in the country. And there is a gun culture in sports, and there remains a gun culture in the country, which has nothing to do with anyone's legitimate Second Amendment rights or their legitimate right to protect their home and family. It has nothing to do with that. There's a gun culture in the country, and it has negative effects. And that was my point. It's been since it was immediately misrepresented elsewhere. And there are still some people, including people who like me, who will say, I really like you, but I disagree with you about guns. I have a right to have them. I don't want to take your guns away. Everything is aggregated now, including this conversation here today, aggregated, misrepresented, attached to a clickbait headline that is made to make everything seem more angry and more binary than it actually is, all the nuance taken out. And so when some people say, I really used to like him and then he went political. On CNN, I didn't just talk about sports when I was asked. On your show recently, you asked me about presidential politics, Dan, but I never did this during games. The idea, people say, well, he's talking about this during games. The answer to that is no, never. There were 2 essays, halftime essays on Sunday Night Football out of more than 100, 2 that could be said to be political. The misinterpreted gun thing and an essay about the Redskins team name. That's it. That's it. That's an objective fact. No matter what people feel, no matter what they want to say, that is an objective fact. And during a baseball game or during an NBA game in the 90s, my frame of reference may be different than some people. There may have been an aside here or there, but there was never anything that was overtly political during coverage of the game, including recently, including the most recent games that I've done. That is simply a falsehood. I'm going to get some people really mad now. As Daniel Patrick Moynihan, look it up, people. It used to be like when you were 15, 16 years old, if you were paying attention, you knew stuff that happened before you were kind of on the planet. Okay, here you go. Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously once said, you're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. It is factually false that I was continually injecting politics. Now, some people may know of the politics and they carry that over in their feeling about me when watching the game. But those are 2 separate things.
I wanted to circle back to what you were saying about not meeting your own standard. Does your own standard come soaked in so much unforgiving that it gets in the way of genuine joy?
There were times when it did. I did, just as one example, the morning after Muhammad Ali died, I was doing a baseball game for the Baseball Network in St. Louis on a Friday night, and NBC called and said, we need you to do an essay about Muhammad Ali, and we'll run it on Saturday during our sports coverage. So I took a 6 a.m. flight from St. Louis to New York, and this isn't quite Lincoln writing the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, but you guys know me, I'm so technophobic. I had a flip phone at that point, so I couldn't open up a laptop and write this thing on the flight. So I wrote it on the back of 2 boarding passes and came in and did it. And it was exactly 3 minutes on the nose, and it was extremely well received. And one of the things that the beginning line was, Muhammad Ali was a beautiful figure in a brutal sport, something like a dazzling combination of this, that, and the other thing. Those qualities made him distinctive. Other qualities made him meaningful. And after I recorded it and walked out of the studio, and then they put the pictures to it after I had left, it occurred to me, wait a minute, a better couplet is those qualities made him memorable. Other qualities made him meaningful, because that kind of rhymes in a way. Memorable, meaningful is better than distinctive and meaningful. And when I think about that essay now, I still think about that could have made it 1% better.
Then it ain't sometimes, Bob. Then it ain't sometimes that it gets in the way of your joy. If that's where your standard is, that you're still bringing that up all these years later, and you know the exact words, and you also know that you hit 3 minutes on the mark, and I'm guessing you're good enough on television that you could do that off of boarding passes without much help getting to exactly 3 minutes. If that's your standard, it's too unforgiving, Bob. There's just no way that it's not perpetually getting in the way of your enjoyment.
Some of my friends and family have said to me, and this is an adage that's also famous, perfect is the enemy of the good. Now, even if something is better than good, if you're holding it to a standard of perfection, you're always going to be saying, hey, I'm more focused on what it wasn't than what it was. But I honestly think luckily I don't have to pay you a bunch of money. I'm not lying on a couch talking to you here, but we go through this therapy session. But I've gotten better about it over the years. I think the irony, Bob. I think I've got a much better perspective on all of it, and a much better appreciation of how fortunate I was, and how it's not brain surgery. It's not going to change the course of Western civilization. But no matter what you do, you're a carpenter, whatever it is, you take pride in your craft. And I have some reasonable pride in the craftsmanship that I brought to it.
Bob, the irony for me is that you chose to love a game where failure is actually way more common. And it is the most, if you had to associate a word with baseball, it would be failure and continued failure. And your lack of tolerance for it jars me a little bit, because you're commenting on something while there's imperfections in front of you every step of the way.
It's also why he was so good, though, because he was that intolerant of imperfection. It's one of the reasons, I think, or I don't know how high he'd put it on the list of characteristics for why it is that he was as excellent as he is, but I'm guessing that him and his own standard is higher than anyone else's standard is for him.
Well, that's probably true, but I'm much more forgiving of flaws, shortcomings, mistakes in others than I am in myself.
You just said was, Dan.
Well, I mean, we're celebrating the end of one baseball career, not the entirety of his emeritus career. We're celebrating that.
No matter what, there's way more behind me than there is ahead of me.
Don't lash out at me, Samson. Okay. You're the one who killed him, Samson. Don't lash out at me. You're the one who asked him who's doing his eulogy.
As I listened to him talk this entire show, it occurs to me that he ought to just write it. And then anyone could just say it, because he's going to say it way better than anybody else will.
Isn't that a tad presumptuous?
That you're going to die?
Somebody sits down and writes their own eulogy.
I feel like it's a virtual certainty. It's a matter of when, not if. And you're so eloquent. I think that would be the perfect
that would be it would be perfect for the vanity business. You to have AI deliver your own words at your own funeral, so the final words anyone hears can be yours. Here it is, Bob Costas, his last show, the final word.
Yep. A voice from the beyond.
Bob, you can sort of pretend you're not considering this as an option.
Will you stop writing his eulogy?
Because I want him to do mine, actually. Because you talked about Muhammad Ali, and Bob, you don't know this about Dan's show, but maybe you do. I announced Muhammad Ali's death.
David Samson killed Muhammad Ali. David, this is a true story. David Samson announced Ali's death to the world. Do you know this?
I'm about to know it, I guess.
I got the call that he died in the middle of a Marlins game, and it was the ninth inning, and the game was ending. So I put an homage to him on the Jumbotron, and it turns out that it had not been confirmed. And I got a call saying from all the news organizations around the world, because the Marlins had just announced, and that's how it was reported. The Miami Marlins have announced the death of Muhammad Ali. And my first call was to Le Batard saying, oh my God, I know he's dead, but no one else does. And I was buckled.
He was hiding in the bowels of the arena. He was hiding, scared in the bowels of the arena, because the sound that you made is exactly the appropriate sound. He shouldn't have done what he did.
Had it turned out not to soon enough be accurate, sadly, then one would have to invoke Mark Twain once again. Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated.
I happen to have known that he had passed because we had a relationship with him as you did, but the family wasn't ready to announce it. And for whatever reason, I just got a call almost immediately about it it's just a bizarre, funny thing.
You want to hear, since you seem to be obsessed with funerals, and by the way, at Muhammad's funeral, Bill Clinton spoke, others spoke. Billy Crystal's eulogy for Muhammad is so magnificent, and it's on YouTube. Everyone should do themselves a favor and look at what Billy said and how artful it was, a combination of heartfelt sentiment and humor, because that's who Billy is. But here's a little story connected to that event. It was like a civic holiday in Louisville when Muhammad had passed. And the funeral procession went through town, and people were lined up 10 and 12 deep along the sidewalks, thousands upon thousands of people. And the memorial service was held in the arena where the Louisville Cardinals play basketball. And it was filled, the seats of the arena itself, but on the arena floor, there were folding chairs for the family and other invited guests. And because of the funeral procession taking so long, the scheduled start wasn't met by 2 hours at least. When in walks Don King. Now, picture Don jacket. He's waving the American flag as he walks in, and he approaches the cluster that I'm in. And he feels as if he has to offer like a little caption for each person. So he's like, Pat Riley, straight off the pages of GQ, Katie Couric, America's sweetheart. And then he turns to me and he goes, Michael J. Fox. And Katie's like, Don. It's Bob Costas. And he's so shameless. He goes, Bob Costas, greatest commentator in the world.
At that time, Michael J. Fox, very, very famous. I'm not sure that's an insult.
Well,
I didn't take it as an insult. I just think it's funny. Michael J. Fox not only was a big television and movie star, Michael J. Fox is a mensch. Michael J. Fox has handled his Parkinson's with such grace and courage and resolve to even for 2 seconds be connected to Michael J. Fox is not a put down. It's an elevation. He's a great man.
Yeah, we've raised a lot of money together for the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's research.
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah,
I'm glad to hear that.
He's done a lot. My best friend's had Parkinson's for 15 years, got diagnosed early. His name is Brett, and so Michael's been great, and Brett's been part of that organization. Dan's been hugely helpful for that as well.
Thanks
1, 2, 3, Brett. Michael J. Fox is a mensch. What Michael J. Fox is not is Bob Costas. It is an insult to not know that was Bob Costas. It doesn't mean, but
it was Don King. Everybody took it in good humor, and I know that Don had at least a favorable opinion on me, because going back 20 years, he had said to me, "Why don't you let me be your agent? Why don't you let me represent you?" And I said, "How do you think Bob Wright, who then ran NBC, and Dick Ebersol, who ran NBC Sports, what do you think would happen if you walked in and said to Bob Wright and Dick Ebersol, I am now representing Bob Costas?" And he said, "Before or after they mop up the puddle on the floor."
Bob, I just want to say, as we head out here, thank you. And I don't mean for today. This is a thank you for all of your decades of being the ear in my head. And I'm not willing to say it's done, and neither are you. You've hung up your play-by-play microphone but your platform and your ability to articulate moments and make memories, that will last, I hope, for decades to come. Dan Le Batard, thank you for your time, because I know it's as short as Bob's, but I do not think that either one of you is Michael J. Fox. I appreciate you both. Dan, something for Bob before we go.
I don't know what the ear in your head is that Bob Costas was. I don't know if you meant a voice in your head.
The voice in my head.
That's okay. But Bob Costas is, I will say again to the people, one of the seminal figures in my business. And I have always admired, beyond everything else that he is excellent at, that he was insistent about having journalism involved in what he was doing in sports. He could have the range to do Letterman in his early 30s and be the funny broadcaster there, but always brought a heft, a weight, a seriousness to sports that I admired, beyond the eloquence, the craftsmanship, and the ability to just broadcast in a sculpted way and make everything look easy. I just always admired that he brought a weight to what it is that he was doing that will be missed. And it's not just in the craftsmanship of a baseball game where you can hear it throughout his career. It was just interviewing Jerry Sandusky live on television when not a lot of people would have had the ability to do that successfully, and 1,000 other things that I can mention here. Too many to mention here. So just very grateful for all the work that he has done over the years. Just a giant admirer of all of it, because despite your unforgiving standard in many places that would look at one word wrong and, ravage himself, you met your standard, your impossible standard, throughout the entirety of while I was watching, even with pink eye.
Dan,
you're a candidate.
Dan, right? Are you interested in being on some kind of standby? I've never given it any thought.
Yes,
but I think I may have identified the leader in the clubhouse for the eulogy.
All right, that's all we were trying to do here, is just kill you and then take the aggregated clicks of the eulogy afterward.
You know what's been great, not just about this, and I really do appreciate it, but the thoughtful appreciations, not just, celebration that's kind of undifferentiated and people are just trying to be nice, but the thoughtful appreciations that have come from so many different directions has been really heartening for me. I was not happy with what happened on the air. I'm not talking about any external stuff. I was hoping to go out on a grace note, maybe not a Ted Williams home run, but maybe a Stan Musial single in his last time at bat. That's what I hoped the Royals and Yankees would be. And I didn't quite measure up to that, and I felt bad about it. But the bigger response, not the noise that comes and goes, but the bigger response and the understanding, even those who said, he's lost something on his fastball, they were comparing it to something that they approved of. And that aligns with my own assessment. And it's really been heartening. I hope it doesn't sound corny. It's really been heartening what's happened over the last couple of weeks. And I thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Earned.